I never imagined the man I trusted most would push me into the arms of someone forbidden. But there I was, standing too close to a man I should have never wanted, feeling my heart race as his eyes lingered on mine. My husband's absence had left a void, and Jake, our house cleaner, was dangerously close to filling it. What happened next? I still can't believe it myself. My name is Emily, and I've been married to Daniel for almost 12 years. From the outside, our life seemed picture perfect. A beautiful home, successful careers, and weekends filled with laughter and friends. But appearances can be deceiving. In the early years, Daniel was everything I ever wanted, attentive, affectionate, and my best friend. We were inseparable. But as his career took off, the long hours at the office began to steal him away. At first, I understood. I told myself he was building a better future for us. But over time, the distance between us grew wider, and so did the silence. Nights spent waiting for him to come home turned into mornings waking up alone. I busied myself with hobbies and social events, but nothing filled the growing void. I started feeling invisible, like I was just another piece of furniture in our home, seen but never truly noticed. That's when Ryan came into the picture. He was 21, a college student working as a part-time handyman. Daniel hired him to help fix up the deck and do odd jobs around the house. I barely noticed him at first. He was polite and hardworking, but nothing more than a worker passing through. Or so I thought. It started with small things, the way he smiled when he greeted me, or how he always seemed to be around when I needed help lifting something heavy. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was just lonely and reading too much into it. But the more time we spent together, the harder it became to ignore the connection forming between us. Ryan had this energy about him, carefree, confident, and so different from the man I married. When he looked at me, it wasn't with indifference or exhaustion. It was like I mattered again, and that terrified me. I tried to push the feelings away, to remind myself of the vows I'd made. But every lingering glance and casual brush of his hand stirred something in me I hadn't felt in years alive. And once that feeling took hold, I didn't know how to let it go. It started as innocent conversations, quick chats about the weather, college life, or the repairs he was working on. But with each interaction, I felt something shifting inside me. Ryan had this way of making me feel seen, like I wasn't just another forgotten wife. It wasn't just his looks, though his broad shoulders and easy smile were hard to ignore. It was the attention he gave me, the way his eyes lingered just a little too long. At first, I convinced myself it was nothing. After all, I was a married woman. But as the weeks went by, I couldn't deny the subtle changes in my behavior. I started wearing makeup before Ryan arrived, choosing outfits I thought looked more flattering. I lingered in rooms where he worked, pretending to read a book or sip coffee just to be near him. Then came the excuses, reasons to ask for his help when I didn't really need it. Moving furniture, fixing a light bulb, even carrying in groceries. Each moment we spent together felt heavier, charged with something I wasn't ready to name. The real turning point happened one afternoon. Daniel had texted to say he'd be working late, again, and I found myself feeling a pang of disappointment, but not for the reasons I should have. Instead, I felt relief. Relief that I'd have the house to myself with Ryan just a room away. That day, he was fixing a cabinet door in the kitchen. I sat at the counter, pretending to scroll through my phone, but my eyes kept drifting to him. His shirt clung to his body, damp with sweat, and the air between us felt thick, almost suffocating. "Hot day, huh?" I said, trying to break the tension. He looked up, his blue eyes locking with mine. "Yeah, feels like summer's coming early." The way he said it, low and slow, sent a shiver down my spine. He wiped his brow with the back of his hand, and I couldn't stop staring. I told myself to look away, to act normal. But then he caught me. "You okay?" he asked, stepping closer. I nodded too quickly. "Fine. Just tired." "From what?" "You work too hard around here," he joked, his smile disarming. Before I could respond, he reached out and brushed a strand of hair off my cheek. It was the lightest touch, but it felt like a spark igniting something dangerous. I froze. I should have stepped back, should have laughed it off. But instead, I stayed there, close enough to feel his breath on my skin. That night, I lay awake in bed beside Daniel, guilt churning in my stomach. But the guilt didn't stop me from thinking about Ryan, the way his touch lingered and how, for the first time in years, I felt wanted. The days that followed only made things worse. I started noticing Daniel's absences more, the late nights, the lack of interest in anything I said. Conversations felt forced, and even when we were together, I felt lonelier than when I was alone. Ryan, on the other hand, was always present, always attentive. He noticed when I changed my hair, complimented the little things Daniel never seemed to see anymore. I knew I was walking a dangerous line, but I couldn't stop myself. Every look, every accidental touch only drew me deeper into something I wasn't sure I could pull myself out of. It started with a touch, innocent enough to dismiss but heavy enough to haunt me. Ryan's fingers grazing my cheek lingered in my thoughts long after he left that day. I told myself it was nothing, just a passing moment fueled by loneliness. But the lie didn't last long. The next morning, I caught myself watching the clock, counting the minutes until he arrived. I felt ridiculous, like a teenager with a crush, but I couldn't stop. When the doorbell finally rang, my heart skipped a beat. "Morning," Ryan said, flashing me that easy smile. I forced myself to act casual. "Morning. Coffee's on the counter if you need some." He poured himself a cup and leaned against the kitchen island. "Rough night?" he asked, noticing the bags under my eyes. "Something like that," I said, brushing it off. But I couldn't meet his gaze. "Is everything okay?" His voice was soft, concerned, and it broke something inside me. Before I could stop myself, the words spilled out. "Daniel and we're just so distant lately. It's like we're strangers living in the same house." Ryan's eyes softened. "I'm sorry. You deserve better than that." The words hit me harder than I expected. I swallowed the lump in my throat and looked away, but Ryan didn't move. He stayed close, too close. "It's not that simple," I whispered. "We've been together for years. I can't just throw that away." He reached out and gently touched my hand. "Sometimes people change. Sometimes what we need changes too." I should have pulled away, but I didn't. Instead, I let my fingers curl around his, feeling the warmth of his skin. Over the next few days, things spiraled faster than I ever expected. Ryan found excuses to linger after his work was done, offering to help with random chores or just sitting and talking. The space between us kept shrinking, and with it, my resolve. One afternoon, as he finished fixing a light fixture in the living room, he flopped down onto the couch, his shirt sticking to his skin from the heat. "You okay?" I asked, trying to ignore how good he looked sitting there so casually. "Just tired," he said, patting the seat beside him. "You should sit. Take a break." I hesitated, but then sat down, too close but not close enough to make it obvious. "You ever just feel stuck?" he asked, looking straight ahead. "Every day," I admitted. He turned to face me, his eyes searching mine. "You don't have to be. I don't know who moved first, him or me." But suddenly, the space between us disappeared. His lips brushed against mine, soft and tentative at first, and I didn't pull away. It was wrong. Every nerve in my body screamed for me to stop. But the way his hands framed my face, the way his touch made me feel wanted again, I couldn't resist. When we finally broke apart, my breath was shaky and guilt began to creep in. "We can't do this," I whispered, but even as I said it, I didn't move away. "I know," he said, his voice low and rough. "But tell me you don't feel this too." I couldn't. Because the truth was, I hadn't felt this alive in years. The days that followed were a blur of stolen glances and lingering touches. Every moment with Ryan felt like a dangerous secret, and yet I couldn't stay away. I found excuses to be near him, to brush against him, to let our hands linger just a little too long. But the guilt was there too, gnawing at me every night as I lay beside Daniel, pretending everything was fine. I started avoiding his touch, dodging his questions, and making excuses for my restlessness. He noticed, but he never pushed. Maybe he didn't want to admit how far apart we'd grown. The final crack came late one evening. Ryan had stayed late to finish fixing a broken cabinet. We were alone in the kitchen, the tension so thick it was suffocating. "I should go," he said, but he didn't move. "Stay," I whispered before I could stop myself. He stepped closer, his fingers brushing my arm, sending shivers down my spine. "Are you sure?" I didn't answer. Instead, I leaned in, closing the gap between us. The kiss that followed wasn't tentative. It was hungry, desperate, and filled with everything I'd been denying myself. When we finally pulled apart, the reality of what we'd just done crashed over me. I backed away, my heart pounding. "We can't. I can't do this," I said, but my voice wavered. Ryan didn't try to stop me. "I'll be here," he said softly. "If you need me." I didn't know what I needed anymore, but I knew one thing. I was too far in to turn back now. I knew it was wrong. Every moment with Ryan felt like I was balancing on the edge of a cliff, one wrong move away from a devastating fall. But I couldn't stop myself. That night, Daniel called to say he'd be home late again. It wasn't surprising anymore. His voice was distant, distracted, as if he barely remembered he had a wife waiting for him at home. When I hung up, the silence in the house felt louder than ever. Ryan was still there, fixing the faucet in the kitchen. He glanced up as I walked in, his shirt damp with sweat, and his hair slightly messy. "Everything okay?" he asked, but the look in his eyes said he already knew the answer. I didn't trust myself to speak, so I just nodded. "Emily," he said my name so softly that it made my stomach twist. "You don't have to keep pretending." "Pretending what?" I asked, even though I already knew where this was going. He stood and stepped closer, his hands resting lightly on my arms. "That you're happy. That this isn't killing you." I opened my mouth to deny it, to push him away, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, my eyes filled with tears, and before I could stop myself, I leaned into him. The kiss this time wasn't hesitant. It was desperate, fueled by weeks of tension and longing. His hands tangled in my hair as I pressed closer, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I didn't hear the door open, but I heard Daniel's voice. "Emily?" The sound of my name snapped me out of the moment, and I stumbled back, my face burning. Ryan froze, his eyes wide with panic, but it was too late. Daniel was standing in the doorway, his briefcase still in hand, staring at us like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, his voice sharp and shaking. "It's not what it looks like," I blurted out, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew how pathetic they sounded. Daniel dropped his briefcase and took a step closer, his eyes bouncing between me and Ryan. "Not what it looks like. Are you serious right now?" Ryan tried to speak. "Sir, don't." Daniel snapped, cutting him off. "Get out. Get out of my house." Ryan hesitated, looking at me, but I couldn't even look at him. The shame was too much. Without another word, he grabbed his tools and walked out, leaving me alone with my husband. The silence that followed was unbearable. Daniel just stood there, staring at me like I was someone he didn't recognize. "How long?" he finally asked, his voice hollow. I shook my head, my throat too tight to speak. "How long, Emily?" he demanded. "It wasn't," I stopped. I couldn't lie to him. "Not anymore." "I don't know," I admitted. "It just happened." His laugh was bitter. "It just happened? That's your excuse." I couldn't meet his eyes. "I'm sorry. Sorry." He shook his head, running a hand through his hair. "You're sorry? God, Emily, do you have any idea what you've done?" I wanted to scream, to tell him that I wasn't the only one to blame. That he was the one who'd left me alone in this marriage, who'd made me feel invisible. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I whispered, "I never meant for this to happen." "Yeah, well, it did," he snapped. He turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, shaking and broken. The next few hours were a blur. Daniel locked himself in his office, and I sat on the couch, replaying everything in my head. The guilt was unbearable, but so was the ache of losing Ryan. Later that night, Daniel finally came out. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, looking at me with eyes full of hurt. "What now?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "I don't know," he said. "But I need time. I need space." And just like that, he packed a bag and walked out the door. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound made me jump, every thought spiraled into regret. I wanted to call Ryan to tell him I was sorry, but I knew it wouldn't fix anything. When morning came, the house felt emptier than ever. I sat in the kitchen, staring at the spot where Ryan had been standing just hours ago, and I felt the full weight of what I'd done. The worst part wasn't the betrayal. It was knowing that even if I could turn back time, a part of me would still crave the way Ryan made me feel. I had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The silence in the house was deafening after Daniel left. I wandered from room to room, replaying the moment he walked out. The disbelief in his eyes, the betrayal in his voice. My stomach churned with guilt, but underneath it all was something even worse, the ache of missing Ryan. I hated myself for it. How could I still think about him after everything that had just happened? But no matter how hard I tried to push him out of my mind, I couldn't. His touch, his voice, they lingered, haunting me. The next morning, Daniel sent a text. "I need space. Don't call me." I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. This was it, the beginning of the end. I wanted to fight for him, to fix what I'd broken, but how could I? He'd seen me with another man. No apology could erase that image. Days passed, and the emptiness only grew. I avoided Ryan's calls, too ashamed to face him. But he didn't give up. "I'm here if you need me." I should have deleted the message, but instead I stared at it for hours. I knew I should cut him off completely, but a part of me couldn't let go. He was the only person who made me feel alive again, and that terrified me. When I finally saw Ryan again, it wasn't planned. I was at the grocery store, trying to distract myself from the chaos my life had become, when I spotted him near the produce section. Our eyes locked, and for a moment, it felt like everything else disappeared. "Emily," he said, stepping closer. I froze. "Ryan, I can't." "You don't have to say anything," he interrupted. "I just need to know you're okay." I wasn't okay, not even close. But I couldn't tell him that. Instead, I nodded and forced a smile. "I'm fine." He didn't believe me. I could see it in his eyes. "I never meant to cause this," he said softly. "It's not your fault," I replied, but the words felt hollow. The conversation was short, but it left me shaken. Seeing him reminded me of everything I was trying to forget. The passion, the danger, the connection I couldn't explain. When I got home, I found myself sitting in the kitchen, staring at my wedding ring. It felt heavier than ever. Daniel hadn't come back, and part of me wondered if he ever would. The thought of losing him forever made my chest tighten, but another part of me questioned whether we'd already lost each other long before Ryan came into the picture. I spent the next week in limbo, waiting for a text, a call, anything from Daniel. But there was nothing, and the longer the silence dragged on, the more I started to question everything. What if this wasn't the end? What if this was the wake-up call we needed? Or what if I'd already ruined any chance of fixing it? Desperation finally pushed me to act. I called Daniel, my heart pounding as the phone rang. He didn't answer. I tried again, and again. Finally, I left a voicemail. "Daniel, please. I know I messed up, but we need to talk. I need to know where we stand." Hours passed without a response, and the emptiness felt unbearable. I picked up my phone again, my finger hovering over Ryan's name. Don't make this worse." But the temptation was too strong. "Ryan," I whispered when he picked up. "Emily." His voice was warm, comforting, and dangerous. "I can't do this alone," I admitted. "You don't have to," he said. "I'm here." And just like that, I let him back in. I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't stop myself. Every time I tried to fix what I'd broken with Daniel, it felt like I was met with a wall. Ryan was the escape, the one thing that made the pain bearable. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't last. The guilt only grew stronger, and every time I looked in the mirror, I hated the person staring back at me. I was trapped between two worlds, one built on years of love and commitment, and another built on passion and recklessness. And I was terrified I'd end up losing both. The house felt colder without Daniel in it. Every creak in the floor and hum of the refrigerator reminded me of the emptiness I had created. I spent hours replaying the moments that led to this. Every ignored conversation, every night spent alone, and every mistake I made with Ryan. For days, I waited for Daniel to come back. I told myself he just needed time to process what happened, but deep down, I feared he was already gone. The guilt weighed heavier with each passing moment, but so did the craving for the connection I felt with Ryan. One night, after too many sleepless hours, Daniel finally called. My hands shook as I answered. "I don't know how to fix this," he said, his voice strained. "Neither do I admitted. "But I want to try." His silence stretched so long that I thought he might hang up. But then he spoke, his voice softer. "Do you even want this marriage, Emily? Or were you just looking for a way out?" His words hit me like a slap. I wanted to scream that he'd pushed me away, that his absence left me broken and vulnerable. But none of that justified what I had done. "I don't want out," I said finally. "I want us. I want to fix what's broken. But I don't know how." "We'll start with space," he said. "And counseling." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. Hanging up the phone, I felt relief, but it was mixed with dread. The damage I'd done couldn't be erased, and no matter how much I tried to move forward, the shadow of what happened with Ryan lingered. I knew I had to face him. The next day, I called Ryan and asked him to meet me. When he arrived, his expression was hopeful, but I could see the worry in his eyes. "Emily," he started, but I cut him off. "This has to stop," I said, my voice firm even as my heart threatened to break. "I can't keep doing this. It's not fair to Daniel, or to you." He stepped closer, but I didn't let him. "You made me feel alive again," I said, tears burning my eyes. "And I'll never forget that. But it isn't real. It's not what I need." Ryan looked like he wanted to argue, but instead he nodded. "I just wanted you to be happy." I smiled weakly. "I need to figure out what that means." And with that, I walked away. The following weeks were the hardest of my life. Daniel and I started therapy, confronting the cracks that had formed long before Ryan entered the picture. It wasn't easy. The trust was shattered, and rebuilding it felt impossible at times. But through the tears and the anger, something began to change. We started talking, really talking, and for the first time in years, I felt like Daniel was seeing me again. I learned that love isn't just about passion or excitement. It's about showing up, even when things get hard. It's about choosing each other, day after day, even when everything feels broken. And as much as I regretted what I did, it forced me to confront the truth about my marriage and myself. I wasn't perfect. Neither was Daniel. But we were worth fighting for. If there's one thing I learned, it's that temptation is easy, but commitment is hard. And sometimes, the hardest path is the one that leads to the most growth. What would you have done in Emily's situation? Could you forgive a betrayal? Or would you walk away? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. And if you want more stories like this one, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another shocking tale. Trust me, the next story is even more intense. You won't want to miss it.